Japan in the 8th and 9th centuries AD was a centralized imperial state. The emperor ruled, the court controlled the land, the army was a national conscript force, but the imperial state was weak at its edges. Distant provinces were hard to control from Kyoto. To protect their estates, powerful landowners began hiring private military retainers. These fighting men were called samurai, from the Japanese word saburai, meaning one who serves. Originally, samurai were simply professional soldiers employed by wealthy families. They were not yet a formal class, not yet a philosophy, just hired muscle. Over the 10th and 11th centuries, as the imperial government weakened, the samurai clans grew stronger. Two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, fought for dominance in a series of wars. The Genpei War of 1180–1185 was their final showdown. The Minamoto won. Their leader, Yoritomo, established a military government in Kamakura, far from the imperial capital. He called himself shogun, barbarian subduing great general. The emperor continued to reign ceremonially. The shogun ruled in practice. This dual system, emperor as symbolic authority, military government as real power, would define Japan for the next 700 years. And the samurai sat at the top of the military hierarchy that made it all work. Here is a correction that surprises most people. For most of Japanese history, samurai were not primarily engaged in warfare. They were administrators. During periods of relative peace, and there were long periods of peace, a samurai served his lord by managing estates, collecting taxes, keeping records, resolving disputes, and performing ceremonial duties. A samurai was expected to be literate, to write poetry, to practice calligraphy, painting, music, and the tea ceremony. The ideal samurai was a man of both the literary arts and the martial arts, what the Japanese call bunbu ryodo. You were expected to be as skilled with a brush as with a sword. This sounds romantic, but it had a practical purpose. A warrior who could not think, write, and reason was a blunt instrument. A warrior who combined martial skill with education and cultural sophistication was a manager, a diplomat, a leader. The samurai class produced some of Japan's greatest poets, artists, and philosophers. It also produced some of history's most ruthless military commanders. Often these were the same people. Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who first unified Japan in the 16th century, was a renowned patron of the arts. He also burned monasteries full of people alive. The samurai ideal was a paradox, and the paradox was the point. No symbol is more associated with the samurai than the katana, the curved Japanese sword, and the katana deserves its reputation. Japanese swordsmithing was, and remains, among the most sophisticated metallurgical traditions in human history. The problem Japanese smiths faced was the iron ore available to them. Japanese tamahagan, the raw steel used for swords, was high in carbon content. High-carbon steel is hard and holds a sharp edge beautifully, but it is also brittle. It can shatter on impact. Pure iron is soft and flexible. It won't shatter, but it loses its edge quickly. Japanese smiths solved this by folding the steel, hammering, folding, and rehammering the metal hundreds or thousands of times. This process created a blade with a hard, sharp edge from the high-carbon steel, bonded to a flexible, tough core of lower-carbon iron. Hard enough to cut, flexible enough not to break. A well-made katana is still considered one of the finest cutting instruments ever manufactured. But the mythology has grown beyond the reality. The idea that katanas could cut through steel armor is largely false. Katanas were designed to cut through relatively unprotected flesh, neck, face, limbs exposed in battle. Against heavily armored opponents, Japanese warriors often used other weapons: spears, bows, clubs. The sword was a sidearm, important, prestigious, beautifully made. But it was not magic, it was engineering. From 1467 to 1615, roughly 150 years, Japan was in almost continuous civil war. This period is called the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States. The central government had collapsed. Hundreds of warlords called daimyo competed for territory and dominance. Every year brought new alliances, betrayals, battles, and sieges. This was the samurai at their most active and most brutal. Three figures dominated the final century of this period and eventually ended it. Oda Nobunaga, ruthless, innovative, the first to use guns effectively on a large scale. He unified central Japan before being assassinated by one of his own generals in 1582. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the son of a peasant farmer who rose to become the most powerful man in Japan. He completed Nobunaga's unification, and then, perhaps to give his warriors something to do, invaded Korea twice. Both invasions ultimately failed. Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient, calculating, and ultimately victorious. After defeating his rivals at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, the largest battle in Japanese history, he established the Tokugawa shogunate. He then did something unprecedented. He ended the wars by making war essentially impossible. He disarmed non-samurai. He froze social classes. He isolated Japan from the outside world. The age of warring states was over. And the samurai, paradoxically, would never be the same again. Bushido, the way of the warrior, is the code of ethics most associated with samurai. Loyalty, honor, discipline, courage, respect, benevolence, the willingness to die rather than live in dishonor. It sounds ancient. It sounds like it guided warriors through 700 years of Japanese history. Here is the complication. Bushido as a formalized written code did not exist for most of samurai history. The word was barely used before the 17th century. The book that defined Bushido for the modern world, Hagakure, by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, was written between 1709 and 1716. That is during the Edo period. The wars were over. Samurai were mostly bureaucrats. A former warrior's retainer writing about the meaning of the warrior way, after warfare had largely ended. The most famous line from Hagakure, "The way of the samurai is found in death." It was written by a man who had never fought a battle. Then in 1900, Nitobe Inazo wrote Bushido, the soul of Japan in English, for Western audiences. It became enormously influential in shaping how the West understood the samurai. Much of what Western culture thinks samurai were came from a 1900 book written in English by a Japanese Christian for a foreign audience. Bushido is real. Its values influenced real behavior across centuries, but the codified, systematic philosophy most people associate with samurai was largely constructed after the samurai era ended. Nostalgia is a powerful author. In 1543, a Portuguese trading ship was blown off course and landed on the island of Tanegashima in southern Japan. The Portuguese traders had arquebuses, early firearms. The Japanese lord who met them bought two. His swordsmith studied them. Within a year, Japan was producing its own arquebuses. Within a decade, Japanese firearms production surpassed Portugal's. Within 30 years, Japanese arquebuses were among the best in the world. The Japanese did not resist the gun as an affront to samurai values. At least, not immediately. Oda Nobunaga was the first military commander in the world to use firearms systematically at scale in battle. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he positioned 300 musketeers behind wooden palisades in rotating firing lines. They destroyed a cavalry charge from one of Japan's most feared warrior clans. In minutes. The gun had arrived in Japan, and Japan had used it better than anyone. But guns had a social implication that went beyond tactics. A gun took weeks to learn to use adequately. A sword took decades. If guns replaced swords as the decisive weapon, then the samurai's decades of training, the thing that justified their social position, their privileges, their identity, became obsolete. That was not a military problem. That was an existential crisis. When the Tokugawa shogunate ended the wars and sealed Japan from the outside world in 1639, something unexpected happened to the samurai. They became administrators with no wars to fight. The Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, was one of the longest periods of internal peace in Japanese history. For 265 years, samurai drew salaries from their lords, maintained their legal privileges, wore their swords in public, and mostly managed paperwork. A society had been organized around warriors, and now there were no wars. Some samurai responded by perfecting their martial arts. developing schools of swordsmanship, judo, archery, and other disciplines into refined arts. Some became teachers, scholars, or Zen Buddhist monks. Some became alcoholics and troublemakers. A samurai with no purpose was a dangerous and pitiful thing. By the 19th century, the samurai class was economically struggling. Their stipends, paid in rice, had not increased while prices rose. Many lower-ranking samurai were effectively poor. Merchants, the lowest social class in Confucian theory, had become richer than the warriors. The social hierarchy said, samurai are at the top. The economic reality said, merchants are doing fine. The tension between the ideal and the reality was pulling the samurai class apart from within. And then, in 1853, an American showed up in Tokyo Bay with gunboats, and everything changed. In July 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed 4 U.S. Navy warships into Edo Bay, what is now Tokyo Bay. 2 of the ships were steam-powered, technology Japan had never seen. The Japanese called them the Black Ships. Perry delivered a letter from the U.S. president demanding that Japan open its ports to American trade. He said he would return the following year for an answer. He returned in 1854 with 7 ships. Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening 2 ports to American ships. More treaties followed with other Western powers. Japan, closed to the outside world for 215 years, was suddenly forced open. The shock was profound. Japan had fallen far behind Western technology, gunboats that the Tokugawa military could not challenge. The samurai class that had maintained order for 265 years could not protect Japan from steamships. A faction of powerful lords decided the only solution was to overthrow the shogunate and modernize Japan at speed. They restored the emperor, a teenager named Meiji, as real ruler. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 abolished the shogunate that had controlled Japan for 700 years, and with it, formally abolished the samurai class. The swords were removed. The legal privileges ended. The stipends were replaced with government bonds. The samurai were told, "You are citizens now." The warrior class that had defined Japan for 700 years was legislated out of existence in a single decade. The abolition of the samurai class was not accepted without resistance. In 1877, 9 years after the Meiji Restoration, a samurai named Saigo Takamori led a rebellion. Saigo was one of the heroes of the Meiji Restoration itself. He had helped overthrow the shogunate, but he had turned against the new government when he saw what modernization meant, a Western-style conscript army replacing samurai warriors. A government that looked to Europe rather than to Japanese tradition. He raised an army of about 40 Iwazaren samurai rebels in Kyushu. They carried swords and traditional weapons. The Meiji government sent 60 Aozaran troops equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The Battle of Shiroyama in September 1877 was the final stand. Saigo's forces, reduced by that point to about 500 men, were surrounded by 30 Iwazaren government troops. He was killed in the battle, either by enemy fire or by seppuku, ritual suicide. The samurai rebellion was over. The 1984 film The Last Samurai, starring Tom Cruise, is loosely based on these events. Saigo himself is remembered in Japan as a complicated hero, a man who fought for a world that was ending, on the right side of the wrong war. There is a statue of him in Ueno Park in Tokyo. He still watches over the city he tried to save from the future. The samurai class was abolished in 1876. Their influence was not. Bushido, the warrior code, was adopted by the Japanese military in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In its military form, it became something darker than the administrator-poet ideal. It was used to justify extreme sacrifice, contempt for surrender, and the brutal treatment of enemies. World War II. Japanese military culture drew heavily on samurai mythology. The kamikaze pilots, whose name means divine wind, were explicitly framed in samurai terms. It is a cautionary example of what happens when a warrior code is separated from the practical humanizing realities of the culture that produced it. But the samurai's positive legacy is also everywhere in modern Japan. The martial arts, kendo, judo, karate, aikido, are global practices. Japanese concepts of craftsmanship, attention to detail, and mastery what some call shokunin kishitsu, the craftsman's spirit, traced to the samurai tradition of perfecting one's discipline. The Japanese car industry, the precision of Japanese manufacturing, the extraordinary attention to quality in everything from sushi preparation to electronics. These are cultural values that have roots in the samurai ideal of mastery. A warrior class that existed for 700 years does not disappear. It transforms. The sword becomes the scalpel, the factory floor, the kitchen knife. The discipline remains, just pointed at different things.